morning or whatever it is in your part of the world. Today I thought I would open the huge topic of good and evil. And I don't hope to get to the bottom of it. If you're watching this live feed, let's see, what's going on here? What is going on? Because I'm not seeing that I'm broadcasting. Hold on just a second. Let's just look at this again. Okay. Yes, we are broadcasting. Okay, so if you're here watching, and I see there are three of you here besides me at the moment, I would very much appreciate it if you would say hello in the live chat so that I know that the live chat is working. So please say hello. Okay. All right. So today I thought I would... Okay. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Miles. Thanks, Gary. Hi. All right. So I'm going to proceed. And today I'm going to start covering the way too big topic of good and evil. And this might devolve into a political thing, I don't know. It's a topic that I know that I can't cover in only one session. And I'm currently allotting an hour and a half to this session, but but it doesn't mean that's the end of it, because I plan to do more of this. And so first of all, I want to talk about Dr. Jung's overall perception of good and evil. And I'm just trying to get on my screen now the comments in real time, because there seems to be a bit of a delay between YouTube and what I'm seeing. And so now I have the comments there. So the first thing I want to do is talk about Dr. Jung's vision of good and evil. And the easiest way to talk about it is that it's one of the dualities. And if you're not hearing me well, please say so in the chat. So good and evil is not only one of the dualities, it is perhaps the biggest one, obviously the one that has been addressed by religion since time immemorial, and one that all of us worry about, but we hope that evil won't get the best of us. Well, that's part of the objective of this conversation. And so Dr. Jung's point was that notwithstanding what we want to think about ourselves in our conscious mind, we each do have a certain element of evil within us. And we suppress it, we repress it in various ways. Some of us by religion or whatever, some of us just by common sense, but it's not always that easy. And even at the end of his life, Dr. Jung was saying that he just hoped that good would outweigh the evil just a little bit in humanity, because he was very concerned, and Dr. Edinger was concerned. In fact, Dr. Edinger said, we're either going to be all one thing or we're going to be destroyed. And we're obviously not all one thing right now. And so how we get to be all one thing is a long, long process. And we're in a transformational stage, and we have to learn to identify evil so that then we can do something about it. Not only, you can't solve a problem unless you know you have one. And Dr. Jung pointed out about 100 years ago, a little bit more perhaps, that Christianity had made it seem like Satan was a children's fairy tale and could be fobbed off simply by teaching people only to be good. But the problem is, the gooder you are, the eviler you are in your shadow. And so the first issue is to recognize that. Now, it's not as simple as this image that I have up here. I mean, you could say that, all right, there's a little good even if I'm totally evil, and there's a little bad even if I'm totally good. It's not quite that simple, because there are layers, and so it's really, let's see here. Let's see if I can get this right. Maybe not. Okay, it's really more like this, that there's lots of parts of us. This is why Dr. Jung talked about alchemy a lot. And within those parts, there are even good and evil in each one of those, whether it's on the white side or the black side. And so our psyches are very complex things. And we have to learn to recognize what's good and what's not good, and that's not always an easy thing. So first of all, let me start this process, and I'm anticipating that there's going to have to be several Q's and A's on this, because I'm reading from Civilization in Transition, which is volume 10 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And today I'm going to read from an essay that he wrote called After the Catastrophe, which was written in 1946, just after World War II. But there's another segment, or another essay in this book called A Psychological View of Conscience, and that brings up a bunch of interesting issues as well. So today I want to start with this idea, which is in paragraph 408 of After the Catastrophe, volume 10. Since no man lives within his own psychic sphere, like a snail in its shell, separated from everybody else, but is connected with his fellow man by his unconscious humanity, no crime can ever be what it appears to our consciousness to be, an isolated psychic happening. In reality, it always happens over a wide radius. The sensation aroused by a crime, the passionate interest in tracking down the criminal, the eagerness with which the court proceedings are followed, and so on, all go to prove the exciting effect which the crime has on everybody who is not abnormally dull or apathetic. Everybody joins in, feels the crime in his own being, tries to understand and explain it. Something is set aflame by the great fire of evil that flared up in the crime. Was not Plato aware that the sight of ugliness produces something ugly in the soul? Indignation leaps up. Angry cries of justice pursue the murderer, and they are louder, more impassioned, and more charged with hate, the more fiercely burns the fire of evil that has been lit in our souls. It is a fact that cannot be denied. The wickedness of others becomes our own wickedness, because it kindles something evil in our own hearts. The murder has been suffered by everyone, and everyone has committed it, lured by the irresistible fascination of evil. We have all made this collective psychic murder possible, and the closer we were to it, and the better we could see, the greater our guilt. In this way, we are unavoidably drawn into the uncleanness of evil, no matter what our conscious attitude may be. No one can escape this, for we are all so much a part of the human community that every crime calls forth a secret satisfaction in some corner of the fickle human heart. It is true that in persons with a strong moral disposition, this reaction may arouse contrary feelings in a neighboring compartment of the mind. But a strong moral disposition is a comparative rarity, so that when the crimes mount up, indignation may easily get pitched too high, and evil then becomes the order of the day. Everyone harbors this statistical criminal in himself, just as he has his own private madman or saint. Owing to this basic peculiarity in our human makeup, a corresponding suggestibility or susceptibility to infection exists everywhere. It is our age in particular, the last half century, that has prepared the way for crime. Has it never occurred to anybody, for instance, that the vogue for the thriller was a large I'm going to read that sentence again. Has it never occurred to anybody, for instance, that the vogue for the thriller has a rather questionable side? I'm going to stop the reading at that point because I think all of us can see that our whole society, probably on a global basis, is permeated by this paragraph this very day, because I would venture that everyone who's watching this video has been watching the news day in and day out about what's happening in the American presidential administration and what's happening in the special counsel's office and so on. And this is what Dr. Jung is talking about, that we're all drawn into these things. And we have to look into our own hearts about that to know what to do about it. And the problem is we really don't have a civilization-wide, or not only not American civilization-wide, but globally, no civilization understanding about what to do right now. And for the last year and a half or so, our news media persons have been just stunned. They say, I don't know what to do about this, or I don't know what to say about this. Well, right, because we had things set up in such a way that it seemed like our civilization was very rock solid. But what we found is that many of the things that we assumed were rock solid have proven to be quicksand. Let me just point back to the Ten Commandments from the Bible. Strictures like "thou shalt not kill" or "thou shalt not commit adultery," those have long since gone by the boards. And so they may have worked in Moses' time, but the farther we get along, obviously the 20th century, we had 175 million people killed by evil that permeated the entire world. And so, Miles, I see, let's see. interpretation at the end of the day is Jesus Christ is unlimited and unconditional love. Okay, I mean, Dr. Jung wrote a book called Ion, which I've been reading into this YouTube channel. And one of the points that he is making is that Jesus Christ has really become a symbol for us as opposed to a historic personage. Never mind what the historic person was. But Dr. Jung's point is, from his psychological point of view, let's say, not a theological point of view, is that Jesus Christ is a symbol for the self. And so, yes, the self is, we can unconditionally love ourselves from that archetypal level, but we can never escape the dark side of God, which was demonstrated in the book of Job and in many other places over history. Obviously, there were plenty of Christians on both sides of World War II who were killing one another right and left, and they weren't really pointing back to their Christianity, and they, you know, many good Christians from the United States killed good Christians from Germany, but there was still evil on both sides. And so I don't know if you're, Miles, are you a pastor or something? What, from whence does the comment about Jesus Christ come? Right. I agree with you that indigenous peoples' creation stories cannot be discounted. What Dr. Jung made clear to us in Answer to Job, one of his seminal works, which came late in life, in paragraph 752 of that book, he said that every religious fact of whatever kind is a fact of the psyche, not a fact of the physical world. And that's sort of a stunning observation, but the implication of it is that every religion is true, because if it's a psychic fact in one person, then it's true. And the question is, how do we deal with it in the physical world? Okay, well, we're all spiraling down the same spiral of reflection. And indeed, depth psychology is all about that spiral. Because we can't go directly to ourself very easily, because the self is in the unconscious. And so the important thing for each of us to do is reflect on it. And yes, it all builds to a singularity. I'll point back to Dr. Edinger's quote that we're all going to be one thing, or we're going to be nothing. We're going to either destroy ourselves, or we're going to learn to live together. Now, there's good news in that, because I think that we have a model for how that works. And I think we need to be able to express a vision about our country, perhaps, that's different from the vision that's sold to us on the television. And that vision is that in the United States, we have every race, every religion, every cultural background, every creation story, and every type of person under the sun. Amazingly, it all works. And so, yes, there are eruptions because human beings are a transient lot. In other words, we're born, we grow up, we mature, and we die. And during that growing up period, we have a lot of education to do before we can even participate in society. And, what we really find is that a lot of these killings, these large killings, are either young people who haven't been fully educated and are not fully prepared for life, or sometimes, like the fellow in Las Vegas, it might be an older person who's been just bunged off of society, is no longer part of society. And so he has resentment within him, and that resentment boils to the surface, and then you have the evil of his murder of all those people in Las Vegas. That was really terrible. Um, okay, thanks for your comment about Hegel. I'm sorry, I really don't know anything about Hegel, and I know that to a certain degree, Hegel was um, an influencer of Dr. Jung's oeuvre, and um, I'm not even very clear how that was. So I'll just admit my ignorance on that point. Um, but again, it all points to either we're going to become one thing or not. And to finish up my point here, the United States as a model is not a sweet model, but what it demonstrates is that the success of a society uh, might be indicated by, for example, who wants to come here from what country. And I think we'll all agree that we have people from every national origin who are today Americans. And typically, it's not Americans wanting to go to their country, it's us. It's them wanting to come to be part of the American experience, the American dream. And I once said that um, the United States represents the essence of the human spirit raised to its highest potential so far, okay, to the extent we've been able to raise it to its highest potential. And so people intuitively know that we have a open society where they can live in freedom. And yes, we have our flaws and warts, and we have our murders, and we have our adultery, like most other countries. But because of the dynamism of our debate, which is allowed in freedom, we push all the bad influences out of the system. So if I think about a metaphor of the tempering of steel, in tempering steel, you're forcing impurities out of the steel so that the steel becomes stronger and stronger. And I think of our debate as that kind of process where every good idea gets adopted, and not only does it get adopted in the United States, it pretty much gets adopted everywhere. And I give an example of Starbucks as an example of that, where Starbucks was a good idea, and it's been adopted within a mile of every urban setting in the United States practically, but it's also been adopted around the world. So I've been to Saudi Arabia many times. I've been in the King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center many times, and in that hospital, there are 4 Starbucks cafes in the building, and that's a very interesting fact considering that the chairman of Starbucks is a known Zionist. So apparently, when you have a good idea in commerce, people will overlook your politics. So that was a good idea that got adopted around the world. Bad ideas get pounded out of the system. So, for example, the House Un-American Activities Committee of Joseph McCarthy in the early 1950s was a bad idea. And it had its day on television, but ultimately it was pounded out of the system because it wasn't helping the United States at all. So anyway, I think there is a model for humanity succeeding if we look at countries that don't allow dissent. They don't thrive as well as the United States does in its dynamism, and there are many examples of that, and they range, and in my personal experience, they range from Saudi Arabia to Turkey to Japan, and to a lesser extent, certain other countries. Obviously, Russia doesn't allow dissent, and Russia's economic dynamism is nothing like American dynamism. The same is true of China. They don't allow dissent, and so they don't get the ideas, and they don't get to advance their society as much as we've advanced ours. So anyway, that's a thought. Let's see if I, okay. Okay. Daniel asks a question. Are you saying the political situation in the U.S. can be explained in terms of Jungian ideas? If so, can you be more specific? What needs to change to make the system more reliable? Well, first of all, I'd have to say that by definition, systems that are concretized are no longer reliable. And so things change, and there has to be a system in which life thrives from the system. And that means life thrives for all citizens. And when you have a society that doesn't allow life to thrive, then you have a system that is impaired, okay, wounded. It's handicapped. It's held back, and in Japan, they have a saying: "The protruding nail gets hammered down." And so, yes, the protruding nail gets hammered down. So you take a person like me, who's now talking about Jung in an open channel on YouTube. There are plenty of people that didn't like what Dr. Jung was saying in the 20th century, and if he had said it in the 16th century, he would have been burned at the stake because his views would have been regarded as heretical. And part of his ideas had their origins in Gnosticism, and Gnosticism was denounced as a heresy by the church, and ultimately forced out of the system. Why? because the Gnostics were talking about having a direct experience of God. And the church wanted to interpose itself between God and the people, because if they could interpose themselves, then they could support their systems. And we see how brilliantly that worked when you look at the Vatican, where there are riches beyond belief that have been funneled to the Vatican from every country in the world, and they've been funneled there because people have been paying the priests to have the direct experience with God. And whereas the Gnostics were in favor of having a direct experience, and because if you have that direct experience, then you're going to know what we're talking about. If you haven't had it, then it might as well be mysticism. And so, let's see. So, what needs to change to make the system more reliable? Well, first of all, human beings ourselves need to transform. This was a fundamental tenet of Jungian psychology, that we have to get beyond the dualities in our societies, and we have to be able to raise ourselves above those things. And so in the context of this discussion of good and evil, first we have to recognize evil. And if we recognize evil, then we can do something about it. But as long as we think that, well, this is just politics as usual, we're not really going to get anywhere, because then we're going to have to continue to have our debates and our MSNBC and Fox News shouting at one another over the airwaves, and we're going to be pushed from pillar to post, and these things will never change. And they don't change so much that because of another Jungian concept that dates back to Aeschylus, I think, and antiodromia, which is the tendency of things to become their opposite. The parties will keep changing sides. Why will they keep changing sides? Because they keep throwing stuff into their political position, whichever side they're on. They keep throwing things into their political position that will give greater weight to their side. And as soon as they put something in their position, the other side will put the opposite thing in their position. And so in my lifetime, we've seen the Democratic Party, which used to control the South and used to be the bigots, people like George Wallace and Lester Maddox, the governor of South Carolina. If you're too young to know who these people are, you might want to look them up on YouTube or just Google their names. But those were the bigots of my youth. But now the bigotry has swapped parties. So now now the South is controlled by the Republican Party, and I fully expect that to swap again at some point in the future, because you can see that we're very divided right now as a country. We have this huge duality between the red states and the blue states. But at the same time, it seems to me that the election of Donald Trump represented sort of a shock to the system. And it appears to me that there will be a movement back toward the center. And the problem with that, as long as you have this horrific duality, is that things will come toward the center, and then they'll just keep going, and the parties will swap positions once again, because just as I'm talking about here, in this image, if they become more and more one thing, then they'll swap back and become the other thing. And you have to imagine this image that I have on the screen here is one that's moving and is dynamic, and so it's never staying still. And some people will be persuaded the other way, and as soon as they're persuaded the other way, then the party that lost them will look for ways to drag them back. That's just the way of the world. And so that's the way enantiodromia works. Let's see. So I think what needs to change in order to make the system more reliable is that we have to recognize that our debate is why the country is so dynamic and so filled with vitality, and has risen to the top of nation states vis-a-vis our economy, vis-a-vis our military, and vis-a-vis our freedom to be what we want to be. And although we have lots of people hating this group or that group within the country, it all works. And yes, rarely we have eruptions around the country of people who go over the top one way or another, but those are dealt with by our police forces by and large, and they're relatively rare. I mean, if we didn't have nationwide television channels that we watch 7 by 24 today, we probably wouldn't even know about most of these incidents. I mean, I'm sure they happened in my youth, but we almost never heard of them. And the national news used to be a 30-minute program. Now we have it 7 by 24, and so things get blown all out of proportion. Okay, let me go back here. Okay, Miles says, unfortunately, a Keaton court case by Dr. Judy Wood, PhD in material science, and author of Where Did the Towers Go, has been refused to be heard by your courts. Okay, I'm not familiar with the case. I do acknowledge that our courts are a mess right now, and I have personal experience with that. And my followers may come to know the details of that over time. I don't speak very much about it right now because the matter's still in litigation. But I will say that, and for those who don't know, Keaton is a court case in which we're trying to force the government, if I'm correct, and I am an attorney, but I haven't practiced except for myself since 1979, so I'm doing this off the top of my head. But a Keaton case, I believe, is a case in which we're trying to force the government to do what it's supposed to do. And the courts don't like those cases very much. If Miles or Daniel Whiteside has any better wisdom on what Keaton is, please let us know here in the chat. So Daniel asks, is there anything really to do? And Dr. Jung's position on that was that yes, we first have to know ourselves, but then we also need to take action. I mean, it's not a question of just going over and becoming a hermit, but first we need to understand ourselves. And I have my own reasons for not liking the current president of the United States, but if I look at his life and the decisions that he faced in his life, I have to admit that if I had come up through that system and with his family as it was and so on, I might well have ended up in the same fix that he's in. Um, he's got a particular problem, and that is that, according to psychologists, friends of mine, he's got a teeny weeny little ego. And so he has to use this bluster that he uses to protect himself psychologically. Um, and It might help, first of all, if we all understood that, here's a man who um, didn't get no said to him enough. And so the result is he rose to a position that he's not qualified for, at least in my view. But a perfect metaphor for what's happened to him is if you look at the movie Florence Foster Jenkins. Now, Florence Foster Jenkins was a very wealthy woman in New York society who loved the opera. And she gave serious money to the Metropolitan Opera. And she thought she could sing. And because she was giving money to the opera, no one said no. And once a year, they would have a benefit in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and everyone would come to listen to her sing. And it was awful, but nobody told her that, because if they told her that, she might go away and not give as much money as she was giving to the Met. And so this got bigger and bigger, and finally her husband was persuaded to book Carnegie Hall for her. And he couldn't sell tickets, so he gave them away to soldiers and sailors coming back from World War II. And so he filled the place, and she did a concert in Carnegie Hall, which, from an operatic point of view, if you're going to have an opera critic listen to it, is totally terrible. But nobody would admit that to her, and it was only because she saw some of the reviews. He tried to suppress the reviews by hiding the newspapers from her, but one or two of them got through, and she almost immediately died because she didn't know that this is what people thought about her, and she had allowed this fantasy of hers to get way out of control and not properly. She wasn't properly matured by her parents, and you just have to have enough defeats in life. And so the lesson in Jungian psychology is that you need to pass through the cycle of the Job archetype numerous times, many, many times in your lifetime, in order to build up your ego to the point that you can handle the slings and arrows of life. And so the Job archetype is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And so a good example of that I use frequently is the television program The Voice, because think of it, most of us have a dream when we're young that, wow, I could be a rock star and sing like Johnny Cash or whatever. And so what The Voice does is it gives everybody a chance. So there's a contest, and most people are defeated. And so they take their guitar home and put it in the corner, and then they lament about how they didn't win The Voice, and then they go on to be reborn into whatever they're supposed to be, a doctor or a lawyer or what have you. And I'm not saying that those are the best things to become, but they will be reborn into the next step of their life. They may be defeated again. And I certainly have had those experiences many, many times in my lifetime. And probably the most significant for me was becoming a lawyer, because I thought, wow, if I become a lawyer, then I'll have it made. So I spent 8 years of my life, 3 years in law school and 5 years practicing law. And what I found out was I really detested the profession. and, and I wasn't the right personality type for the profession. And so it was a defeat for me. But then I was reborn into something else, and that gave me more strength in my ego for later in life. Okay. So, practical self care suggestions to strengthen one's moral core in the face of collective madness. Um, well, I think that practical things that you can do is pay attention to your unconscious. Your unconscious speaks to you constantly in dreams and visions, and those things aren't ephemeral. That's your unconscious sending you messages about your life. And it's not that you need to follow that message, but you need to work with it and try to understand it. For example, let's suppose that you're having trouble with your wife, and you decide that you're going to get a divorce, and then suddenly you have a dream that is on the opposite side of the equation, saying you should go back to your wife. Well, that's not a dream that says that that is the right thing for your life. Okay, that dream comes from what Dr. Jung called the 2 million-year-old man, who is in us because of our DNA going back to before human beings existed. It's actually much older than 2 million years old. It's more like 3 or 4 billion years old since the first life on the planet. And so we have grandparents all the way back to that. And those grandparents developed us the way we are. We've evolved from that. And that 2 million-year-old man or woman is what you get at birth. Okay, it doesn't change after birth. It's in there from the beginning. And so if that unconscious part of you decides that you should go back to your wife, well, it doesn't mean anything about your conscious life, because your unconscious doesn't have to live in the 21st century. You do. And so we have to learn how to understand ourselves first. And so if you have a dream that tells you you should go back to your wife, then it's certainly important to reflect on that piece of wisdom, but know that that piece of wisdom comes from a part of you that's millions of years old, and it doesn't have to live in the 21st century and with the circumstances that you have in your life. And so you need to reflect on those messages. But that's what they are. They're messages that are telling you that something is out of whack. Dr. Jung commented that at the end of his life he didn't dream anymore because he wasn't getting any of these messages. He had pretty much gotten his life in order, but I think the rest of us have dreams from time to time, and so we need to learn to work with them. And if we do that, in terms of the moral core, one of the things is that we'll develop a conscience. And as I was looking at this book today in order to have this conversation, Civilization in Transition, and the later essay that Dr. Jung wrote on conscience, I'll be talking about that in future Q&As. But if you want to go look it up, it's you could probably find it in the library. So let me just mention that it's called A Psychological View of Conscience, and it begins at paragraph 825 of volume 10 of the collected works. And if you don't have the book, you can have access to it on our Dropbox. And if you want to join our Dropbox, you can send me a normal email to skip.conover@gmail.com so that I have your email address, and then I can add you to our Dropbox and share what's in there. One of the things that is in there is electronic versions of the collected work, so you could get volume 10 from that folder in the Dropbox. And so I'm open to that. We currently have, I think, 77 members of that Dropbox, and you're welcome to have access to it. Okay. Miles, for your information, you would find an interesting interview of Dr. Lanza, physicist and author of Beyond Biocentrism, on CBC Radio Ideas program. Physicists talking about consciousness before the Big Bang. I'm sure that could be quite interesting. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Jung carried on a very detailed discussion with Dr. Pauly. I can't remember his first name just offhand right now, but there's actually a book of their letters going back and forth in which they were talking about the conjunction of physics and consciousness and psychology. And so I have no doubt that that may be very interesting. Obviously, it needs much more research in that area. And Dr. Jung rued the fact that we really don't know anything about the unconscious yet. I mean, psychological research has been largely emphasis on behaviorism, which is a very superficial level of the psyche. And what Dr. Jung was talking about was depth psychology, which is very deep psychology. Dr. Judy Wood points out an alleged fraud by government contractors who wrote the 9/11 Commission report. A person cannot sue the government, but can sue those contractors who might have defrauded. Okay, Miles, I really don't know anything about that. I have no idea I have no doubt that there have been frauds, and there certainly are ways to get at people besides strict laws, because as soon as you have a strict law, then you have lawyers trying to find a way around it. And this is the flaw in concretism and the flaw in rationalism, because there's also life. And let me give you my quick metaphor for this. There's a scene in The American President where Martin Sheen is talking to Michael Douglas about whether Michael Douglas, as President of the United States, will contact Annette Bening for a date. And they're having this conversation over the pool table. And Martin Sheen says to Michael Douglas, well, we'll have Lewis put together some numbers on that, meaning some statistics on that. And Michael Douglas takes his pool cue and slams it down on the table, and he says, no, you won't do that, because this is not about my presidency. This is about my life. And the point is that we have to see what grows, what living thing grows from the matrix of ourselves. And whenever you slice and dice things in rationality, that isn't life. Statistics don't give you life. Okay, so for example, I went to a business school that was part of the Chicago school cabal of Milton Friedman, and it basically was 15 courses in statistics by different names. And they believed that, everything could be decided on statistics and, the quarterly report. Well, obviously that wasn't true because we had the crash of 2008. And to this day, those professors don't understand that. They don't want be human human factors in the MBA program, and obviously that's caused lots of unethical behavior over the years. We've trained two generations of MBAs to be psychopaths, actually, and it's to the detriment of our society. Okay. Let's see. So Lady Shea says, does Jung say anything about how you can strengthen a weak ego? Um, I think if you read Answer to Job, you'll start to get it. I don't think he spoke to it quite in that way. Dr. Edinger, in many of his books, this is Edward Edinger, who wrote Ego and Archetype and many other books, talks at length about the God image and about Answer to Job, which is Dr. Jung's book. And he's the one from whom I learned about the Job archetype and the issue of contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. That's how you build your ego, because now you're not going to make that mistake again, whatever it was. And his point is that we're going to grow our ego the more times we go through that cycle where we're defeated. And I think I've said this in previous Q&As, but James Hillman in a audio tape that I listened to about 20 years ago made the comment, can't we find a defeat in here somewhere? And his point is that it's only through defeat that we grow, because if we're not defeated, we just keep going on. So in the case of Florence Foster Jenkins, she was never defeated. She kept paying money to the Met, and people kept clapping politely when she sang her aria every year. And right up to the point where she sang at Carnegie Hall with 3,000 sailors and Marines in attendance. And the irony of that is that Carnegie Hall reports that the recording of that day, of that performance, is the most popular recording that they sell at their gift shop at Carnegie Hall. So, okay, so, nobody said no to Donald Trump after his father sent him to Wharton School, at least. I guess his father was mad at him one time and sent him off to military school. That was always the threat that my parents and in the group that I was in, the status I was in as a Navy junior. I was the son of a naval officer, and my father's threat was always that if I didn't shape up, he would send me to military school. Well, that actually happened to Donald Trump. But since then, very few people have said no to him. And the result is that you can see he's like a deer in the headlights in his administration, because he just doesn't understand why everyone in the government doesn't fall down at his feet. And so he never built up the ego to, or the knowledge for that matter, to understand how these things work in the federal government. I mean, yes, in a private company, you can pretty much get away with doing whatever you want to do if you're in control and you have all the money, and if you don't like it, you can fire people, which is the thing that he sold his television program on for years and years. But as long as nobody says no to you, you're not going to build up your ego. And so you see a man in the White House now that really doesn't understand what's happening to him. And it doesn't look like the results are going to be good in the long run. So I'm sure there'll be movies made of it, though. Let's see, what if there's been too many defeats too close together so the ego never has a chance to lament and be reborn? Well, that's bad luck, I guess. I think obviously we need to educate our children better about psychology for all kinds of reasons. One of them is that we have half the marriages in the country falling apart because people don't understand what's going on in their psyches. And, some people get killed in combat. Some people walk in front of a bus. One of the strongest women I know today is a woman who was run over by a city bus in New York City in front of Macy's department store. And this happened when she was 14 or 15 years old. And she spent 2 months in the hospital getting put back together. And today she's one of the strongest people I know. And she's lived quite a long life so far. I hope much longer than now. And so she has had a chance to lament and be reborn. But, if you get run over by a city bus, or you have too many things happen to you at once, or you put your head up in a foxhole, as my roommate from the basic school did, and you get your head blown off, well, there's that just, things happen. And so, we live in a dangerous world, and we can only do what we can do. And, if you're taken for some reason because your plane crashes or what have you, well, there's not much your psyche can do about that. But, if you understand how your ego can be built, then you're going to be a lot stronger, because then you're going to accept the defeat, whatever it is, and recognize that you need to reflect on that defeat. That's what lamentation would be. But then you have to move on with your life. And, whatever you're lamenting about, that wasn't meant to be in your life, whatever it is. I have a dear friend that was born in Gaza, in Palestine. And, I can't change that for her. She lives in Gaza, and she has certain strictures on her life that most of us would find totally oppressive. And that can't be changed. But I can teach her over time how to be the best person she can be. And that's what individuation is about, which is one of Dr. Jung's primary principles. There's a Q&A that I did the other day on individuation on this channel. So what did Jung say about finding meaningfulness in the midst of suffering? Well, what he said, and it's a central tenet of his oeuvre, is that you need to find meaning in your life. And that's what individuation is about. And it is, it's in you. And it was in you from the beginning. And we can't predict what slings and arrows will come your way in a lifetime. But ultimately, if you keep at it and you keep getting yourself through the Job archetype, ultimately you're going to find it. Let me see if I can find my image that I used the other day. Just a second. Okay, here it is. Okay, so the metaphor that I like to use for this is the statue of David, because David, as you see him in this picture, actually you're only seeing the top half of him because we're prudes in the United States, but in any case, David, as you see him today, was always in that same block of marble. He's probably there for 1 billion years maybe. And about 500 years ago or so, some Italian quarrymen dug up this piece of marble. And with great difficulty, they dragged it over to a cathedral in Florence. I think it was in Florence. I don't remember precisely, but I think it was in Florence, and put it down next to the cathedral. And obviously the priests, I guess it was priests in those days, had to do something with this block of marble, and they were in the business of making statuary. So they had several sculptors try. And the first two started on this block of marble, and they couldn't do anything with it. And so obviously they were defeated by the block of marble and went off and became lesser known sculptors if they stayed in that industry. But Michelangelo took the same block of marble, and he could see David in the block of marble. And so he began to chip away at it. And he burnished it and chipped at it for 4 years. And ultimately, David emerged. And so you can think of David as yourself. And the magical being that you were intended to be can only emerge if you let the slings and arrows of life wash off you and let the chips be taken as they may, and ultimately you will find a meaning to your life, and you should find a meaning to your life. And you can have a provisional meaning of your life every day. You can get up in the morning and you say, what is the meaning of my life today? And it doesn't have to be, something that they're going to write on your tombstone every day. But if you do that every day, ultimately there will be something to write on your tombstone if that is important to you. But meaning is a central tenet here, and so that is the meaningfulness of suffering, because the slings and arrows of life are the suffering, and in Buddhism, they say all life is suffering, samsara, and we have silly little quotes like "you can't get out of life alive" and that sort of thing, and the point is that there's suffering for everyone, and it begins very early in life. If you go to a kindergarten classroom on the first day of school, you can see it in spades because there'll be 20 little kids all crying because they're having to leave their mother. Well, that's an early version of suffering. And so that's a chip out of your marble right there when you're 5 years old. That you can't, you're no longer the king and queen of your household, but now you have to work for your supper. So let's see. And thank you, Gary, for your comment. Yes, it is a Pygmalion metaphor. So My Fair Lady is another example of that, where Professor Huygens was able to take a flower girl, at least in George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, was able to take a flower girl and turn her into a lady. And that's what we're talking about. How do you become a man or woman that people respect throughout your life? And fortunately, I've been somewhat lucky in that in various ways. I've certainly had a lot of slings and arrows, but here I am. I'm still here. So anyway, so it's nearly 3:30. If there are other questions, I'd like to take them now. And if not, I will terminate this session for today, and I will come back to the issue with additional paragraphs, but let me see if I've covered this. Okay, so one of the key points that Dr. Jung is making in this paragraph 408 of volume 10 is that when you see evil, it kindles evil in you as well, and it becomes a collective thing. And so if we understand that fact, then maybe we can save ourselves from going down that route. But we certainly see how a president that has basically gone against every tenet of our civilization, of our American system of government, and almost everything that most Americans, I believe most Americans believe. If we take an issue like DACA, where 80% of Americans agree that we should do something rational for these young people that have been in our country for decades. It's a pretty simple issue, but the president has gone against that. And even though most Americans feel that way, we have members of the Republican Party who 18 months ago thought that Donald Trump was a joke. Today they're going along with his point of view. And so you just see how his attitudes of destroying everything that we've built up in this country over 400 years has been attacked by his administration, at least in my view of the situation. You see how that position that he's taken has started to permeate our society. And it's very concerning to me because I know enough about what happened in Germany in the 1930s to know that a very similar thing happened there at that time. And so we have to be vigilant, we have to be conscious of what is happening to us, and it's it's a very serious psychological issue that we need to get a handle on. And I'm sorry to say I don't think that our politicians are up to it yet. And most of them don't have a clue about any psychology, let alone Jungian psychology. Most of our legislators are lawyers, and so they have a certain rational aspect, but they don't understand what can come up as jungle creepers and destroy what the founding fathers and our parents and grandparents, going all the way back, what they built in this country. I know my wife and I almost every night look at each other and say, "My God, I'm glad my father never saw this, because he would be shocked." And that's the way I feel too. Okay. I had many duality in my dreams, polar opposites, but still one. Did Jung comment on it? Sorry for my bad English. Well, no problem about your bad English, and certainly you could do machine translation, and I'll try to make allowances. But yeah, I mean, there's everything about Jungian psychology, and if you go through the entire 20-volume collected works, you're going to find duality everywhere discussed. And I think that both Dr. Edinger's and Dr. Jung's view on it would be that you should reflect on those dreams and keep working with it. And one of the reasons I'm doing this series and why I decided to create the channel and why I created the Archetype in Action website in 2010 was that I have found that Dr. Jung's work has helped me psychologically now for 30 years, more than 30 years. And we all have our troubles, okay, and I don't want to bother you with mine, but every time I get in a bad place psychologically, if I pull out a piece of Dr. Jung's work and just read almost randomly in it, it helps me, and I don't know why. I never was trained in psychology. I'm not a mental health professional, and I guess I should have put my disclaimer here up on the screen, which maybe I will do. I'm not trained as an analyst, and I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not here to give you mental health advice, but I have found that over the years, Dr. Jung has really become my therapist, and so I don't think it's always necessary that people have to go to therapy. I believe that we can heal ourselves in some way, and I feel that I've accomplished that. And so anyway, Miles, thank you for your question. The website is Archetype in Action, and I'll put that in the chat here. It's Archetype, oops. And the URL is this. And you'll see that that's a very built out website. There's a lot of material there. And I wrote a book called Political Psychology, New Ideas for Activists. You'll find that in the Dropbox. If you join the Dropbox, you can just have the electronic copy. I'm not here selling books. But anyway, in order to get in the Dropbox, my email address is skip.conover, CONOVER, @gmail.com. And so if you write to me as soon as I can get to the computer after I receive your email, I will add you to our Dropbox. And there's just way more than you can deal with in both the Dropbox and the website. But anyway, I'm going to continue to do these Q&As. They've proven to be quite popular. And so for the next few sessions, I'm going to be talking about evil and referring back to some of the things that Dr. Jung was talking about in evil. And you're quite welcome. Okay, I think I have to get ready to go pick up my wife from work, so thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Now I have to remember how to turn this thing off, but anyway, I guess we can do